Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to my talk, particularly towards the end of Develop. I appreciate it's been a long few days for a lot of us, so I'll try and make it sort of as entertaining as possible in these dying hours. I really do appreciate it. It's called 5 Practical Production Hacks. I'll get on to sort of the meat of the talk and what it's about in a moment. First, I'm going to start with a little bit of context about who I am and who our studio is. So my name's Stuart. I'm the senior producer at Fail Better Games. We're an indie studio. You might not necessarily be aware of our work, so I'll just do a quick rundown of that. We started in 2009, way before I was at the studio, with a browser game called Fallen London. It's a continual live service game. It's kind of like a sort of text-based RPG, choose your own adventure-y type game with an action economy where you grind up resources to unlock the next part of the story. And it started all the way back, like I say, in 2009. It's been going for 15 years and established this shared universe that all of our games so far have been set in, the universe of Fallen London. A strange place where London has been dragged beneath the surface of the earth during the Victorian era as part of a bargain with some unknown cosmic entity. So our players are sort of very loyal, still play that to this day, and we're still sort of put a lot of resources into updating this and releasing new content for it on a continuous basis. And then our other games, like I said, have all been set in this universe. So next up in 2015, we released Sunless Sea. This is for PC, desktop, Mac, Linux, and consoles as well. This game is more of a standalone single-player RPG. You're the captain of a steamship on the Untersee, this sort of vast underground sea as part of the cabin in the universe. And it's kind of like a sort of roguelite element, maybe a bit of space trading type flavor of game with a lot of, again, text-based story content. We're all about narrative text-based games. Then it's Sunless Skies was a sequel to that in 2019. It's very much a direct sequel for all the consoles and PC. This time, you're the captain of a space locomotive. But otherwise, it's very similar to Sunless Sea with some gameplay improvements and a new setting, a possible future of this universe where it's kind of like a sort of a fantasy Victorian version of sci-fi. Then just recently, we put out a game called Mask of the Rose. This one is a prequel to all of the existing games in this universe. So far, we've released it for the PC, Mac, Linux desktops, and Switch, and we're going to be working on PlayStation and Xbox One versions soon. This is a visual novel, a prequel to all of these games, and it kind of zooms in and tells a sort of more personal, character-driven story in this universe. It's got elements of it's kind of like a dating sim with elements of murder mystery in it as well. So that's just a little bit of context. Thank you for bearing with me. Now, my talk, 5 practical production hacks. The reason why I chose this as a topic was because I think in production, it's quite easy for us to talk in very general terms and sort of try and give information in very broad, general terms that you might sort of go away not really knowing how to truly action in your day-to-day jobs. Or the opposite can happen, and I could talk very, very much in detail about things that our studio does that aren't really applicable to the lives and work of anybody watching it. And I will do a little bit of talking about our studio to use some examples. But what I wanted to try and present was 5 hacks, 5 things that I've picked up in my journey as a producer. They may or may not apply to each of your job roles. But I hope that everybody in the audience can go away with one or more of them thinking, that's a good idea, maybe I'll try that out. So they're on no particular theme, apart from the fact that all of them, I think, are actionable things that you can try to do if you haven't already done this in your day-to-day work. So, hack number 1. Build automation, brackets, you're not too small for build automation. Now, you might look at that, and if you have an idea of what build automation is, and I'll get onto that in a moment, you might think, well, this sounds like more of a sort of a technical focused topic. It's more of a sort of DevOps tech pipeline thing. Of course, that's very relevant for producers because it's still part of the production pipeline. And it's also relevant because every one of these things, these bits of tooling or DevOps innovation that we introduce into our companies has an effort cost associated with it. And ultimately, producers are responsible for that effort cost. And I'll get onto that in a bit more detail in a moment. So just to begin with, a quick definition of build automation, in case anybody isn't sort of already familiar with this. I looked up the Wikipedia definition, but it was quite incomprehensible, quite technical. So I've just written my own sort of civilian definition. Build automation is when you build your game, i.e. compiling the code, packaging all of the assets up, probably running some tests and things like that, remotely. So not on a developer's personal workstation, but off remotely somewhere, either on a server or a cloud server, something like that. Either based on an automatic trigger, for example, somebody committing some code to a repository, or sometimes on demand. And there are various tools that you can use to automate your builds. I've just stuck up the logos of a few of them there. I'm not going to get into detail about sort of how you select a tool. I'm not an expert on that, and the answer is probably very different for very different circumstances. But the big engines, Unity, Unreal, Epic, they offer tools. They're open source, things you can use to do it. That's the logo of Jenkins, a little butler there, a piece of open source software, another one called Travis, as well as companies that offer sort of DevOps solutions, source control, things like that. So JetBrains offers TeamCity, GitHub, GitHub Actions, and Atlassian Bamboo. But I'm not going to go into depth about those, despite rattling off the names. Those are all things that you can use to do build automation. The point that I want to dwell on is that any tooling work or DevOps type work you do must show return on investment, like almost any decision you make as a business. And in terms of what we're investing in this context, I'm mainly going to be talking about programmer effort. There probably is also some cost in terms of things like paying for servers or software and things like that. But mostly you're probably going to be investing time for your programmers or for your colleagues to set this stuff up. And I think this is particularly pertinent in small teams. Teams where you may only have one or two, in the case of Failbetter, gameplay programmers at your disposal. You don't have a dedicated tool team like you might have in a larger organization. So any time that you take and you use to do tooling or to look at pipeline and DevOps stuff, that's taking time away from the game. So we want to see a really good return on investment, particularly if we're in a smaller organization. We want something like this. For a small amount of development time, you get back a lot of time saved. That's ultimately what we're getting back. This thing isn't going to directly profit us in any way. We're not going to be selling this. It's not part of the game that we're selling. There's no revenue stream from it. So what we're also getting back is going to be measured in terms of time saved. We don't want a situation like this where we assess the amount of development time that a programmer might have to put into our tooling, and then in return, we don't get as much time saved back, or it's a sort of marginal situation. So I say all of this by way of preface, really, to explain that I'm really very, very, very discerning about spending time in this way. I'm always like on the lookout to try and make sure that it is a good return on investment, and I'm really careful to not take that gameplay programmer time that we need to build our games away from the game itself. With that said, I think that build automation represents an excellent return on investment, even for small teams. So it's one of those areas of DevOps that I think that you should really seriously look into, even if you're just a team of a handful of people, and figure out whether this might actually sort of save you time quite substantially in the long run. There are various reasons why I think it is such a good return on investment. I'm going to go through these, and then I'm going to go into depth with some examples about why I think it represents that. So firstly, build automation is something that is used by multiple disciplines. It's not just a tool that you build for the programmers or the testers. It's something that can be used by quite a large range of people. It's reusable across projects. With a bit of extra work, you can probably find that you can reuse it for your next project. It saves the programmers themselves time. So, like I say, when you're in this situation where you don't want to take your gameplay programming time away from actually making the game, well, here you have some reassurance that that time invested from the programmers will actually come back directly to them as well. And it can be extended to other uses. I'll get on to more about that in a little moment. So, to give a worked example, this is what we used to perform build automation. Something called BuildBot. This isn't related to a continuous integration framework you might have heard of the same name at all. This is just our internal name for it. This was something that was built by my colleague, who's the lead programmer on Mask of the Rose, Seamus O'Budokan. Now, what it uses technically is Jenkins, this off-the-shelf open source server software, with a Slack integration mediated by an AWS Lambda function in the middle. So you type in commands on Slack, and then it pops out with a build later. Like I say, not a technical talk. I can get into all the technical details if anybody wants to later, or I can just point you to my colleague and go, yeah, he made it work somehow. So, each of my bullets. Firstly, used by multiple disciplines. This is not a particularly elaborate solution, the thing that we've cooked up. It's pretty simple and straightforward, and just enough that we need for our use case. It's certainly not over-engineered. Those are all the commands. You don't need to read them all, but that's all the commands that you can send it via a Slack message. It's not very complicated. So anybody from any discipline, even if you don't feel like you're particularly technical, can pick that up and use it. And it's used by, in our company, and this is in roughly descending order of frequency, it's used by QA. They use it very, very heavily. You know, if you're a QA analyst, you want to have new builds of the game to test daily or even more frequently. It's used by programmers themselves a lot, particularly, again, for activities related to QA, for debugging and things like that. I use it a lot to get an idea of the state of the game and for similar activities. Writers use it. In Fail-Better, writers contribute sort of directly to either a content management system or the Ink code base. So writer belies the fact that they're also game designers and scripters as well. They use it an awful lot. Artists use it, and comms use it. You know, our marketing team of one, our comms director, she also frequently, you know, needs to understand like something about the product, the state of the product, and play it a lot. So we've got 6 disciplines there, and that's just within sort of our organization. Build automation can be used by a lot of people. It's reusable across projects. So far, we've used our system to automate builds across Mask of the Rose, our new game I was just talking about, Fallen London, new versions of the web front end. We actually replaced that with a GitHub Actions based solution for technical reasons, but we automate that as well. And we're also working on a new project in a new universe that I can't talk too much about, but we're also automating all of the builds for that. So you have quite a sort of a high upfront cost, but then the unit cost, if you like, of adding new projects to a build system can be much lower. It saves programmers time. Gameplay programmers save time. Those people whose effort you want to very diligently protect, they actually get their time back as well. And again, I'm aware that I'm speaking in a situation where we don't have a dedicated tooling team. So this is perhaps less pertinent if you're working in a larger organization. You actually sort of set up a team to do that because that effort is already sort of ring-fenced for this. But in that case, you probably already know the benefits of the build automation system and already definitely use one. When you're making a local build, we use Unity as our engine, but I'm sure that this is true on any engine you care to mention. It locks up local workstations. It wastes your programmers' time. Even if they can do other things in the background, it still tends to drive machines to a halt for quite long periods of time. It might not be truly wasted time. Maybe they can go and get a cup of tea or whatever, but it does sort of force them to break context and down tools while they wait for this thing to build. It saves distribution time as well. So imagine, yeah, say like the comms director asks for a build. Prior to using this, we'd probably have to do something like a programmer or maybe QA who knows how to make the builds, makes a build on their local workstation, uploads it to Dropbox or some other cloud-based storage, and then the customer has to, the internal customer has to download it again. What a faff, absolute waste of time. Far better that an internal customer can just order an automatic build for themselves. Here's an artist's impression of a programmer waiting for a build in Unity. And then finally, you can extend automated build systems to do a bunch of DevOps things that you might find pretty valuable. You can add automated deployment into it. For example, for London, you press it's sort of a one command button to actually deploy a new version of the front end without any more human mediation. You can even integrate it with platforms. So, for example, our mass builds are pushed directly to Steam, GOG, and Epic if you use certain commands in BuildBot. We do put a little bit of human mediation in here, just like a sort of final sense check that we want that build to go live to players. But it handles the business of uploading it for us as well. And you can add automated testing to a build automation solution people very frequently do. So, for example, Ford and London uses automated testing as well. Now, I asserted earlier, without any evidence, that one of the reasons why I really trumpet this particular bit of tooling is because of the excellent return on investment. But I didn't show you any data to back that up. Well, I've had a go at evaluating the kind of time that this has saved us. So it took about 15 days of programmer effort to build BuildBot, and then I'm also counting into this various bits of maintenance. There is an ongoing maintenance cost and the cost of adding those new projects to the system that you saw as well. And then I've tried to evaluate the time saved from it. Now, we have made 1,827 successful builds and deployments using this system. We've had it for about 3 years now. There are some assumptions behind that. Firstly, failed builds have a value as well. So I'm only counting successful builds here, but sometimes a build failing tells you that there's a bug in a branch that you need to fix and things like that. There's also, this is probably belying the fact that some of these builds will be ordered and not used as well. But then on the other hand, many of the builds will be used a lot, like by multiple people, and say multiple people time as well. So with those sort of slight provisos, I've come at this at about an assumption that each one of these successful builds saves about 10 minutes on average. which isn't unreasonable considering the amount of time that Unity takes to build things. So that so far would give us a 3-to-1 return on investment, and we're very much not at the end of life of this system either. In fact, we're kind of in the early phases of working on our new project that also uses this. So to summarize my first point, build automation is worth the time invested, and it's worth looking at even if your team is small and you don't normally have time to be doing a bunch of fancy tooling. So moving on. Hack number 2, meetings aren't free. Now, this might sound like a really trite point, but meetings cost time. It might sound like quite obvious or even trite. I wouldn't make this point if it wasn't so easy to overlook this. Let me sort of show you what I mean. Meetings have a lot of multiplicative and hidden costs. So I've used a worked example here. Periodically, about once every quarter, we have a Ford and London strategy meeting. It's a large meeting, it involves a lot of people. The last one, I tried to keep the length down to 1.5 hours instead of 2. There are 11 attendees involved, so there's quite a lot of people who are stakeholders in some fashion in Ford and London and what we're doing, who are either directly developing the game, have some responsibility, are stakeholders in some fashion. It took me about 10 hours to prepare for this meeting, rather on the high side, but it involved a full slide deck, a bit like this. It involved going off and getting a bunch of analytics ready and things like that. It's quite a lot of prep time. 3 of the other attendees also spent some prep time in this meeting, averaging 1 hour each. So the total cost of that is about 4 days of work for one meeting, admittedly quite a large meeting. What I'm trying to make is that they really do cost actual real time. And there will be some other meetings that have costs not listed there, things like minuting and writing up the minutes, stuff like that. So what I'm trying to suggest here as my hack is just simply count your meetings. In whatever form of planning you use, whether you're estimating things through time estimates or using story points or whatever, actually sort of plan out meetings as if they are a real activity. Now, of course, there are rules that you can set around this to make this less onerous to manage and to avoid having to create a bunch of tickets for every single meeting and making the admin onerous. If you do stand-up meetings daily, for example, or recurring meetings like sprint planning, you can probably just take those as a recurring overhead and adjust people's sort of time availability accordingly, because those are very, very predictable, and you don't need to bother with those. You might want to set a time limit for whether you count meetings or not. A 5-minute phone call is probably too short to be worth the admin. Where it's a meeting that lasts 30 minutes, maybe an hour, maybe that's where you want to set your time cutoff of actually trying to take people's time into account and acknowledge the time that they spend in these meetings. And then there's also the category of meetings where they're already accounted for in other work. Things like programmer or designer time working on a feature. Maybe your programmers and designers, they've been given a task together to work on this feature. Any sort of meetings, any kind of calls and idea sharing they have as part of that, you've kind of already you assume that there'll be some interaction there, right? So you've already taken that effort into account, hopefully, when you were estimating and planning your work on this feature. So I wouldn't say you need to monitor those separately either. So I'm not trying to make things onerous for anybody's sort of administrative side by saying count your meetings. So make sure you acknowledge them in your planning activities. You can set some rules to make the amount of meetings you have to count manageable. Are they part of a predictable overhead? Are you going to set a length threshold to count those meetings? And obviously, is it part of an existing work item? Are meetings bad? No, that is not what I'm saying at all. It's not an anti-meeting crusade. I'm merely suggesting that it's important to remember that the time that they cost. They aren't free. So when you need to hold meetings, you need to acknowledge the time impact on the rest of your work. That's all I'm saying. My third hack, using a scripting language. How many producers are there in the room? Not the majority. I guess everybody else is just interested. Cool. What do producers love? Yep. That's coming up in point 5, I think. What else do they love? Spreadsheets. Hey! Oh, lovely, lovely spreadsheets. They keep everything nice and organized. We love spreadsheets so much. This is my little shrine to spreadsheets. So you're already using spreadsheets. If you're a producer, you're definitely using spreadsheets. I'm not even going to argue about that point. I'm just going to assume it. What I'm suggesting is that you deepen your love. Now, you probably are already familiar that Microsoft Excel has for many, many years offered VBA, Visual Basic for applications, a scripting language you can use to automate spreadsheets and a whole bunch of other stuff in the Office suite. Google offers a similar thing. Google offers AppScript based on JavaScript. I tend to use Google products rather than Microsoft products. And I found that when I use AppScript, it has a sort of a little side benefit for me, which is that it increases my empathy for our programmers because it's an object-oriented language not dissimilar to the C# that they use in Unity. But there are lots of other ways that you can leverage scripting language. One that I'm not going to go into much depth about here is Python, very, very, very popular for automating desktop applications. But here's the crux of my point. I'm not simply suggesting that you learn a little bit of a bit of scripting, a little bit of VBA, so you can automate your spreadsheets and get wonderful metrics easily out of them, as you probably already do. What I'm suggesting here, and this is sort of my takeaway, is that it's great to get ambitious with it. Why stop at automating your own work? There are many kind of business problems that I encounter, and that perhaps you do in your organizations, that do require a tech solution that don't necessarily require a sort of robust programmer-led solution. And often problems where you don't really have any appropriate middleware or sort of out-of-the-box package you can use to solve them. So you as a producer might be able to help out with this. And I am aware as well that what we talk about when we talk about a games producer covers a variety of different roles in practice. You may be more or less technical, more or less specialized. This might not be something that's relevant to you at all. But I think it might be, particularly if you're the producer in a smaller company. You know, in Fail Better, like I was saying, we're a small company. We've only got 17 people. We all have to wear multiple hats. And I'll show a few examples of that now, of how I've used scripting language to solve some business problems where, as I say, it's not something where we would want to devote specialized programmer efforts to solving it. Me just mucking around, doing a little bit of scripting was good enough. So the first example of this was we set up a key mailer solution for distributing Mask of the Rose, the soundtrack and the game. It works a bit like this. There's a Google form. You put your email address in there. In the sort of middle, there's a script. It retrieves your key from a database, and then it mails it to you. It's a very, very, very simple solution. But it's good enough for our purposes, which was firstly distributing, sending a sort of mail shot out of these keys, and then this thing to retrieve it later. Now there are probably, I'm sure there are in this case, loads of third-party solutions that we could use for that. But with about half a day of my effort, we now sort of own our solution for life. It's very cheap, and it really probably will save us quite a lot of time later on as a business. When we've run Kickstarter campaigns in the past, we found that fulfillment can have a really long tail. So people are still mailing us today for Sunless Sea keys. I've got my stats here. 10 years after that game was first crowdfunded. People's keys go to their spam, or they sort of get lost in their inbox and stuff like that, right? So this is an example of the kind of thing that you might want to use your scripting language skills for. Another example was we recently did a security audit. We wanted to look at Google Drive files that were shared externally. This is something that would have taken thousands and thousands of hours of manual effort for my colleagues to do. There weren't really good tools to do this. Google Drive doesn't really have anything like that off the shelf. And there are various third-party apps that didn't quite do what we want and also looked a little bit dodgy, giving access, complete, unfettered access to all of your files to these rather suspect-looking apps. So again, I built something fairly simple. There's an Excel sheet that acts as a front end. You click on a button, you give it permissions, and then it sends you, generates a sheet showing you where you've shared all the files in your Google Drive externally, and then the human can, rather than go through thousands of files, go through a few dozen cases and figure out if they're harmful or not. So, to summarize this hack, using a scripting language. It's a very flexible skill that will help you solve both production and also maybe wider business problems, and has the bonus of helping you understand the challenges that your coders might face a little bit better. My fourth hack. I will take questions at the end, by the way. I know I'm sort of speeding through these a little bit, but of course, time is limited. So my fourth hack is kind of like a realization I came to about production. And I've called it share the numbers. So, people underestimate. I'm going to just ask everybody to accept this as a premise of the talk, rather than trying to go in and explain this with all of the psychological research that shows this to be true. I'd like to ask everybody just to accept that as a premise for now. And everybody does it, and producers aren't immune from it. But discipline estimates are valuable. That information that comes from your colleagues who are experts in art or writing or programming or whatever it might be, that's useful data. It might be affected by the human tendency to underestimate everything, but on the other hand, it does come from their specific area of expertise. You need that data. So what do? We put it to the test, is what we normally do as producers, right? We try and correct the underestimation by, instead of imagining a happy future, trying to look at data from the past. We keep our effort data. We look back at past tasks, and we try and sort of squint at them and go, that's rather comparable to that, and that overran a lot, so why would we assume this should be any different? Stuff like that, right? We use our data to try and correct this underestimation. But my takeaway is that we should be proud of this. So all the producers in the room will probably know exactly what I'm talking about at this point, and I'm not telling you anything new. The thing I've realized is that people are way more interested in hearing about this data and about looking at the past than you might assume. You might think, oh, this is dry, this is producer stuff, this is stuff that only I need to care about. My colleagues are creative people. They don't want to know about my numbers. In my experience, this really hasn't been the case. People don't assume that it's just producer stuff. And I found that my colleagues, at least, surprised me by the interest they take in this. After all, quantitative evidence is very persuasive. You're working with smart people, and smart people are persuaded by quantitative evidence. Nobody thinks it's boring, irrelevant to them, or not their department. They want to look at this less biased data and take that into account. They are interested in seeing those figures. So, to give a worked example, quite a while now ago, we released an expansion in Fallen London called Seafarer. So this is like a sort of a content expansion to that web game I was talking about that takes some of the themes and mechanics from our Sunless Sea game, the game where you're a boat captain, and then sort of brings them into Fallen London. It was a big piece of work, big enough to get its own poster that we launched in Fallen London a little while ago. So here's just a sort of real life example of me working through the estimation of that with one of my colleagues. So firstly, our writer on the project, Bruno, gives me an initial estimate. These are all summarized from Slack conversations, but I don't want to put the full thing up. So Bruno, being very used to this game, actually presented me with an initial estimate. Was a very diligent and quantitative driven person. So he already sort of broke everything down in a spreadsheet in terms of branches. Branches are a unit of measurement of writing in Fallen London. What that means specifically, you don't really need to be aware of, but it's a fairly good way of sizing a piece of work in Fallen London is to use branches as a kind of representative for length. So I looked at that, and it was really good breakdown of the content that had been planned for this piece of work, and I queried it with some data. So I looked at the branches and the sort of the estimate he'd used for like the average branch count, and looked at some past examples of work, ambitions, which were reasonably mechanically simple, and how long they took per branch. And then railway stations, which were much more complicated from another piece of program of work we've been doing, and how long they took by branch, and sort of put those back to Bruno. So he accepted that, and then started to categorize the branch breakdown by whether they were more or less complicated kinds of branches. He identified that some of the things he'd be writing were way up at the upper bound of complexity. Some of the things, more of a sort of a standard low-level thing. We updated the spreadsheet with that, ran the numbers, and then came to a final calculation and agreement. And that's from a writer. So that's somebody who you wouldn't necessarily would normally think, oh, writers will be really interested in the production process, and they're going to be really interested in doing a bunch of spreadsheety maths with you. But in this case, Bruno was. And we came to ultimately sort of an agreement about what we both thought would be a sensible estimate for the project, which held pretty well, as the case would be. So, to summarize, sharing the numbers. Your colleagues are receptive to using quantitative data for planning and estimation. They will surprise you by how interested they are in looking back at the past. Don't just dismiss it as producery stuff. And my final point, bundle your questions. So, a producer is often seen as the person with all of the questions. This is another point that might sound a little bit stereotypically contradictory, right? Asking questions, as we probably already know, is not free. If meetings aren't free, neither are questions. They have a time cost in answering them. They also have a task switching cost, sometimes called a set switching cost. Again, there's psychology, research behind this, and I'm not going to get into today. But it's fairly easy to understand intuitively. When you ask somebody to swap what they're doing for something else, their concentration gets broken. It takes them more time to get up to the same effectiveness at the new task because they're switching back and forth. Sometimes it's best to set a plan in motion, then let somebody get on with it. You don't want constant interruptions to somebody's work. But of course, if you're a producer, you need the information. You can't get all of the information automatically either. You might think that's a solution to it. But the problem is there's a time delay to getting that kind of update. That's if your colleagues remember to update your issue tracking software at all. Or to summarize, no one likes updating their Jira. We all absolutely hate it. Here is a producer's perspective. There's a developer in front of you. You're asking them to update your Jira. Etc. So what I like to try and do is when I need to ask planning questions, which I do on, well, probably normally a sort of 2-week cycle, I try and bundle them all together as one. This is a very blurry image, not because it's secret, just because the content here isn't really important. This is me asking Luke some planning questions in advance of our sprint planning. There are, I think, about 15 bullet points there that I've bundled together in one. Now, when I actually ran this talk for my colleagues just to practice it, they actually suggested some other benefits as well that they got from this approach to asking them for planning information. Firstly, a writer suggested that she got better, that she was able to offer better answers because I was asking questions which had the same context about, i.e. about planning together. So it gave more of a sort of broad picture. So even ignoring the fact that this means less set switching for her, she felt that like her answers overall were better simply because I was giving a sort of a bigger picture overview of all of the pertinent planning stuff to her at the same time, which I thought was really interesting. And then one of our programmers pointed out that by asking your questions in a bundle like this, you're also kind of inherently giving the answerer permission to self-schedule the answering, rather than saying, hey, drop what you're doing, interrupt this really important gameplay feature you're trying to program, and now answer my planning questions. You're actually sort of saying in a rather expected, predictable way, Stuart asks me for these planning questions about this time every week. He's given me these 12 questions. I'm going to carry on working on my feature, and then at the end of the day, I'm going to go back and I'm going to spend, it might take me like, 15 minutes, an hour, who knows, but I'm going to have to spend a bit of time thinking through and maybe doing some research to answer all of those planning questions, but I can schedule that for when I want, because I also indicate, the relative urgency of these and kind of when I need an answer back. Another good example of this working are office hours. So the Fallen London writers, they actually have regular kind of office hours where they all chat to each other about questions of law, brainstorming new ideas, planning matters and things like that, things that are relevant to me as well. And they have a separate set of office hours for any support requests that are tricky that they've had come in, support tickets, and that they need to all compare notes on to answer in a satisfactory way. So again, more Slack, don't have to read this, but there's an example of it in action. And this kind of question bundling works really well for them as well. So bundle your questions. Seeking information as a package minimizes task switching, and it gives colleagues better context. That brings me almost to the end. So to recap, you're not too small for build automation. It's a very valuable part of DevOps I would look at, even if your studio is tiny. Meetings aren't free. They have a cost. Just be aware of that. Use a scripting language, really helpful for production tasks and probably wider business problems. Share the numbers. Your colleagues are interested in your numbers as a producer. And bundle your questions. Try and avoid task switching by asking people questions in a nice, manageable, bundled way and not constantly interrupting them. Talking of questions, I've got like 2 minutes, I think, for any questions, if anybody has them. Thank you. Nobody has any questions at all?
Interested with the bundle your questions thing, because I find that putting several questions in one sort of message, I only get one answer back from the several questions rather than all the questions answered.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like if there's such thing as too many questions in one post, effectively.
Oh, I don't actually know of a particular tactic to prevent that, but it's a very good point. Yes, people do sometimes forget about answering every question in a bundle, and they have to go and chase them a little bit. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for that, to be honest. Maybe we could compare notes. I think that's no more questions. My talk ran a little bit over, but if anybody wants to ask questions personally, just come and talk to me afterwards. Thank you very much.